I don't know if you've been in church for a long time, most of your life. I grew up in church. We meet people all the time at our church that didn't grow up in church. They don't know a lot about church, so they get to learn it. But at our church and other churches around the world, they do a thing called communion, and you've probably done this before. But communion is a renewed version of something that happened long ago. And if you go back into the Old Testament and you read in the book of Exodus, you will find that there was a moment in history that called the Passover. And in that moment, God has sent his guy to lead his people, Israel, out of bondage of Egypt, right? And so they had this destiny that he has for them, but they are enslaved by these people, and he's leading them to this new destiny and this salvation that is coming. And some of it took place by, the parting of the waters, and they walk through that and then leads them into the wilderness and eventually the promised land. But before all that, as he dropped some plagues on the people and enslaving them, there was a moment where he told them all, put the blood of the lamb over the door, and this next plague, which is going to kill people, is going to pass over you. And people celebrated that moment. And I say people, Israel has celebrated, anyone that had believed in that had celebrated it all throughout history. All the way leading up to one specific moment where it all changed. And so in Matthew 26, if you read, you will see Jesus, who had walked with his disciples, gets them all in this room, and they're preparing, and they're going to have this last moment together. But they don't really know this. Like, they know things are going to be different, things are coming, but they don't fully know what's going to happen after this. But Jesus, he does. And he gets them in this moment for what he knows is going to likely be the final time that they get to eat together. And they do this Passover meal that they have done all this time, but this time it was very different. The festival, the festivities, all this stuff was going to be very different. So they're sitting in a room, and I can imagine the intensity. And if you know the story of Jesus being crucified and resurrected and died, all of that started with him having to die first. And you can imagine the intensity in his mind of knowing what is coming. You even read later that he's praying with this intense prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I can imagine in this room, as he knows what's coming, he every now and then taking a deep breath, a sigh of fear, and just this scare of the pain that might be inflicted on him pretty soon. And I always wonder, how did he fully know? And I look, and as I read it, again, it hit me for the first time. I read where in the communion where he says, take this bread, it is my body broken for you. And drink of this cup, this wine is my blood poured out for you. And he's speaking of a body that's not yet been broken and blood that's not yet been poured out. And helps me in a season like this when I think of Easter and what it really means to put myself in that room, sitting in the seat of Peter or Judas. As in this scripture, if you read in Matthew 26, you will see he even calls out Judas, the one who would eventually betray him and hand him over. And I sit in the same seat, invited to the same table. Each year I take myself to that spot, and it just reminds me of the gravity of what actually happened. And so what I would offer you today, invite you to today and this week, leading up to Easter, was that you would put yourself in that seat. Because likely you're one who has been betrayed or has betrayed, like Judas, or maybe you're like Peter, one who has denied Jesus, or like any of the other disciples in their humanity. I would invite you to sit at that same table just in your mind and picture what it must have been like, what Jesus must have felt in that moment, knowing what was coming. And then maybe the resurrection, Easter, the risen King, maybe the whole vision of that, the perspective that might change for you today. Maybe today would be the day of your salvation, where Israel was looking for theirs, and in that moment you see Jesus is the salvation they finally find. And maybe you're looking for that today. Maybe you've already found it and it's renewed for you today. Either way, I invite you to that room, to that table, and to that moment.